Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we've got a long-form solo album review, the newest project from Gabe Lee called Drink the River. This is going to seem a little strange to describe, but here goes. For as simple as his formula might seem within indie country, I would argue it's actually a little difficult to describe what Gabe Lee does so goddamn well. Now, I first got on board with Honky Tonk Hell back in 2020, and initially I thought the reason I loved the album so much was because it was a breather that year, a respite, a road story with a rakish troubadour that had so much natural charisma that made him incredibly easy to like, despite some morally dubious behavior. I mean, that created adventure and wit and good-natured humor, and that when paired with some of the most warm, textured instrumentation and production, really seemed to amplify having just a good old time. Maybe a little old-fashioned in certain spots, perhaps, but never overplayed. A lot of old Hollywood charm, tastefully updated that it never felt like a throwback or an affectation. It's just kind of the way he is. It's a performance, but one that comes through subtle amplification rather than playing up a character. The songs just felt very lived in, and that made some of the more romantic gut punch moments, or just reality, the gut punch moments in general, hit like a ton of bricks. Now, while I want to stress that I was cooler on his album The Hometown Kid last year, it was still excellent. One of my top 50 in 2022. The embrace of more sweeping Americana textures was perhaps a little bit more windswept and chilly, but the commitment to all those small details and that same sense of charm, it still really came through, even if I was missing some of that wandering spirit. As you could tell, Gabe Lee felt a little more settled in a place. That being said, the buzz was suggesting that there was already another project that was waiting in the wings for a pretty quick turnaround time, and sure enough, we've got Drink the River. Reportedly, it was going to lean a little bit more acoustic, with only 9 songs here, one being a re-recording from Gabe Lee's first album, Farmland, and one a long-buried Leonard Skinner deep cut, and it's going to run pretty lean at around 35 minutes. And this time, though, I had expectations. Gabe Lee has not released anything I would call less than great, and that sets a really high bar for an artist. So what do we get from Drink the River? Well, goddammit, he did it again. I knew from the first couple of listens that Gabe Lee once again made one of the best albums of this year, and every repeat listen confirmed it with perhaps his most warm and melodically inviting album to date with Drink the River, embracing slightly more neo-traditional tones for a rollicking great time that still manages to find those moments to rip your heart out. So unbelievably consistent that it's kind of hard for me to pinpoint any flaws. If you're a fan of any stripe of country and hadn't had Honky Tonk Hell on your radar, this might be the one that'll win you over in spades. And given that I've got this sneaking suspicion that given his base in Nashville and some pretty steady groundswell, he could be on the cusp of something a little bigger quite soon, I think you'll want to get on the ground floor now, because this is something special. And yet again, what's truly amazing is that the central formula has not really changed that much at all. Gabe Lee still has that warm, inviting, natural charisma and low-key sense of humor. In that framing, that a lot of folks have drawn comparisons to John Prine, especially given his voice. You know what, I'm not sure I've ever really bought that comparison. Prine's homespun sincerity would often sneak up on you in between some of the lighthearted humor. It's still powerful, but there's a slightly more traditional streak to the showmanship, whereas Gabe Lee's presence has always felt a little bit more heavy and contemporary, a bit more reserved and serious, where the levity is absolutely there, probably manifests closest on the jokey closer property line, but it's tempered, it feels more modern. Now, part of this is Drink the River feeling a little bit more somber and low-key compared to how riotous Honky Tonk Hell is, and I do wish there was a little bit more of that electric spark, but again, that's me early nitpicking, and it ignores the big new addition on this album as a whole that won me over in spades. Such a pleasant surprise. Multi-tracking and vocal harmonies. Gabe Lee's used some of them before, but it's often been a little sparing, often used for emphasis, where the blending wasn't quite as punchy as it could be. Hell, that might have been what was fully missing to put me over on Hometown Kid, put it over the top, come to think of it. But not only has the rougher edges in the vocal mastering been polished up this time, right from the first track, The Wild, the vocal layer layering sounds impeccable. Not just his overdubs, but also the gentle introduction of some female vocals that will flesh out and deepen some of those harmonies. And when you consider how the plucky acoustic guitars, the banjo, the pedal steel, the harmonica, and some truly terrific mandolin and fiddle slide in, it feels stridently neo-traditional in the way that old Alan Jackson songs can feel, impeccably balanced and yet endlessly likable. Now this is where I have to highlight Gabe Lee's production team, in addition to himself, in Alex Torres and David Dorn. An album otherwise so mid-tempo and relatively understated, it needs vibrant production to accentuate good melodic tones, or it might just slip into the background, or feel a little bit too much like a neo-traditional throwback. And both these guys are working their asses off to ensure there is this burnished richness to the sound, and some actual hooks, and even some groove. It's the reason I don't mind that with a more robust and layered sound, they re-recorded Eveline, while still preserving its spare, plucky texture. And my god, that fiddle and bass on that song does sound incredible. And just how well the cover of All I Can Do Is Write About It, that has that mid-70s southern rock feel, especially with the harmonica. It's a really impressive cover. And there's so many other little notes that I just love. I love the subtle, rollicking flourish at the end of The Wild, the interplay between the fiddle and the acoustics on Even Jesus Got the Blues. It's some of the best melodic interplay I have heard all year. How Heart Don't Break slides in that fiddle. Drink the River feels biblically inspired, but not quite indebted to gospel. And the homespun but heartbreakingly spare Merigold and Lidocaine, they are phenomenal in the intimacy of their framing and their mix. The former feeling so haunted, and the latter in its resigned but yearning prayer for understanding. Both remind me of how effectively a singer-songwriter like Ian Noe will captivate an audience with such a spare accompaniment, and honestly, that's high praise indeed. So naturally, with the sound being this restrained, low-key, and borderline acoustic, it's designed to draw more attention to lyrics and themes, so let's dig in. And the first thing I want to highlight is Gabe Lee is so goddamn great at painting an emotional scene with relatively few words that there is always that level of ambiguity in his storytelling, but that's not what I treasure the most. That comes with empathy and the framing of his work. Now, a lot of this album circles themes of what we can and cannot control about our lives and our larger world. And if Honky Tonk Hell had him taking a somewhat rambunctious balance to the road, and the hometown kid felt a little bit more wearied and settled in that realization, this album feels like exploring more of the cost of that calling. He still has that wild side, but now he's found a love back home that he wants to preserve against some of his own impulses, and the grace and empathy he tries to give to everyone in the frame is actually pretty admirable. To reference Ian Noe again, there can be that harsh brutality of the world in some of the scenes that he paints, whereas for Gabe Lee, the circumstances might actually be just as dire, but he wants to believe that for as many of us are caught up in this shuffle, some wonderment and hope can still persist. This album's actually optimistic. It's one reason I really like how he writes about religion and God. The third verse of 30 Seconds at a Time, still a masterwork, but Even Jesus Got the Blues is a very worthy second, telling the story of trying to help a hitchhiking addict, mostly failing, and how her wildness might disturb or exasperate some in her wake as she cavorts across the sacred, but he knows not to judge her, not his place. Or hell, in Merigold, when he makes a prayer having already lost someone from cancer, his plea, if it's not too much for God, not too much trouble, is to go with his love should that cancer strike again. And I really like how he does frame his struggle around women. Mostly, and despite his troublemaking ways, the framing is wide enough to hold himself accountable, and there is some of that complex ambiguity. Heart Don't Break is a very worthy companion to a song like Jason Eady's Daylight and Dark, and Lidocaine is maybe even more devastating, writing possibly from the perspective of someone with dementia or a songwriter who might be skidding off the rails in more ways than one, and hoping just for a little bit of grace in his own fuck-ups. I mean, he's not being malicious or intentional, but those fuck-ups do happen. And that's where I think some of Gabe Lee's choices that might appear questionable to a certain audience if they start digging really deep actually pick up more resonance. The re-recording of Eveline is a prime example, showing the cost of being so cavalier with someone's affections. And Property Line shows him trying to get drunk and flirty, only to get knocked on his ass by this girl's ex-girlfriend, not what he was expecting in this city. Now this, along with that Leonard Skinner cover, has prompted a couple observations that the this album can trend a little conservative in some of its lionization of individual property and rural countrysides getting overpowered by cities that don't really reflect the same values, systems that he doesn't really think can change. But I think there is some context that's missing to the larger conversation. This is not Jason Aldean and his newest god-awful remake of Flyover States, which will play on fears of encroaching degeneracy that Gabe Lee simply does not have. He's too realistic, but overall optimistic as well. And more to the point, there are a lot of city types who still treat folks in his space in rural spaces and his genre like simpletons or walking stereotypes, which is also just not true for Gabe Lee and a lot of others. There's human complexity. The trepidation is not without weight. But again, this is where empathetic framing, a sense of tangible individual responsibility, paired with self-awareness that does not make excuses for himself or avoids emotional numbness, that goes down a lot easier. It's a lot easier to like. It's old-fashioned for sure, but I wouldn't say in a bad way. But yeah, absolutely phenomenal album. One of the best of 2023 by a tangible margin. So warm and inviting and melodic that even if you might be a tougher sell on this brand of stripped-back organic indie country, I reckon you'll find a lot to like. It reminds me a lot of a great Alan Jackson album. There's a surety to Gabe Lee's poise and presence and emotional honesty that I really appreciate, and you rarely see it outside of this particular brand of country. I mean, indie country has been having a banner year, well, maybe country at large, and an album like this deserves a special place in that conversation, at least before he gets his justly deserved break and the conversation gets a lot bigger. I mean, I've been singing Gabe Lee's praises for a couple of years now, and you are out of excuses. Absolutely, check this out. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. I got a lot on my schedule going forward, but hey, I wanted to get out an album review that even probably will not get that much traction, but this album, it is so special. You really want to hear it. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get albums on my schedule, or support the channel beyond my merch, or hell, just want to argue with me on Discord more directly, link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I understand. Options available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.